Kira Vasquez remembered the day she arrived on Corin 4, and she remembered thinking that she had never seen a green so hungry before. The shuttle had dropped her onto the landing pad with 30 other prisoners. And within seconds, the jungle had reached for them with vines that moved like snakes and leaves that turned to follow, their body heat like eyes tracking prey in the dark. She had been a xenobiologist once, a scientist who studied alien life on distant worlds. But that life belonged to someone else now, someone who had made the mistake of helping refugees escape from Valkyrie territory. And now she was just prisoner 7714 on the most dangerous penal moon in the galaxy. The prison had no walls and no fences and no guard towers. And Kira understood why within her first hour on the surface, the jungle was the prison. Toxic spore clouds drifted through the canopy every few hours. And if you breathed them in without protection, you would choke and die within minutes. Your lungs filling with fluid as the spores grew inside your chest. The rain was acidic, strong enough to burn through clothing and skin, and even the hard chitin armor of the Torvan prisoners, who thought themselves tough enough to survive anything. The roots of the trees were carnivorous, and they would sense vibrations in the ground and burst up to wrap around your ankles and drag you down into the soil, where you would become fertilizer for the very plants that killed you. And yet the Valkyrie Dominion expected prisoners to survive here, and they gave them the tools to do it, but those tools came with chains attached. Every prisoner received the standard issue shelter pod, a small tent made of synthetic materials that could resist the acid rain and filter the toxic air. And as long as you had your tent, you could survive, but the tents belonged to the Wardens. The Wardens were the insectoid overseers who ran Corin 4, tall creatures with 6 limbs and compound eyes that could see in every direction at once. And they carried shock staves that could drop a Gorvathi warrior with a single touch. They watched everything, and they missed nothing, and they made the rules very clear to every prisoner who arrived. Obey, and you keep your tent. Resist, and the jungle takes you. Kira learned this lesson quickly, and she kept her head down and did her work in the processing facility where prisoners sorted minerals for Dominion shipments. And she did not cause trouble, even when she saw terrible things happening around her. She watched a Torvan prisoner beaten for moving too slowly. She watched a Gorvathi elder denied medical treatment because he could not meet his work quota. She watched, and she stayed silent because she wanted to survive. And survival meant keeping her tent, and keeping her tent meant obeying the Wardens no matter what. 3 months passed this way, 3 months of silence and obedience, and watching the jungle press against the edges of the prison yard like a living wall waiting for its chance to devour them all. And then the Zelini child changed everything. The Zelini were a small species with soft blue skin that glowed faintly in the dark. And they were not built for hard labor or harsh conditions. And many of them died in the first weeks after arriving on Corin 4. There was a child among them, a young female named Tiri, who could not have been more than 8 cycles old in human years. And she had been sent here with her clutch mother, who was dying of a lung infection that the Wardens refused to treat. Kira had noticed them in the yard, the child trying to support her mother as they walked to the workstations each morning, the mother growing weaker and thinner with each passing day. And then one evening, Kira saw Tiri slip away from the food line with extra ration supplements hidden in her clothing. And Kira knew what would happen if the Wardens caught her. She wanted to look away. She wanted to pretend she had not seen anything. She wanted to protect herself the way she had been protecting herself for 3 months. But then the Warden grabbed Tiri by the arm and lifted her off the ground, and the child screamed in fear. And something inside, Kira broke open like a dam that could no longer hold back the water behind it. She was moving before she knew what she was doing, pushing through the crowd of prisoners, who all looked away because looking away was how you survived here. "Put her down," Kira said, and her voice was steady even though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The warden turned its compound eyes toward her, and she could see herself reflected 100 times in those dark surfaces. A small human woman with dirt on her face and defiance in her eyes. "You speak to me, human?" the warden asked, and its mandibles clicked together in a sound that might have been amusement or might have been anger. "I speak about Dominion law," Kira said, and she reached into her memory for everything she had learned as a xenobiologist who worked with alien governments. Juvenile prisoners cannot be punished for survival crimes when their guardians are medically incapacitated, and her mother is dying because you denied her treatment. So everything this child has done is covered under Provision 7 of the Prisoner Rights Compact. The yard went silent. No one spoke to wardens this way. No one cited laws and provisions and compacts as if prisoners had rights worth defending. The warden dropped Tiri to the ground, and for one moment Kira thought she had won. But then she saw the look in those compound eyes, and she understood that she had made a terrible mistake. "The human speaks of law," the warden announced in a voice loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "Then let law be applied equally to all." Kira felt the cold hand of fear grip her stomach as she realized what was about to happen. She had not saved Tiri at all. She had doomed them both, and everyone else in Block 7 along with them. The warden raised its shock stave and pointed it at Kira like an accusation, and its mandibles spread wide in what she now recognized as a smile. "Collective punishment," the warden declared. "Block 7 has harbored a lawbreaker, and Block 7 will share in our consequences." And Kira understood then that her act of compassion would cost more than she ever could have imagined. The wardens moved through Block 7 like a storm that could not be stopped, and Kira watched them tear apart everything that kept the prisoners alive. They started with her tent first, 2 wardens grabbing the shelter pod and folding it up while a third held her back with a shock stave pressed against her chest. And she could feel the electricity humming through the metal, just waiting to burst into her body if she moved. "This is what happens," the senior warden announced as he walked through the block with his 6 legs moving in perfect rhythm. "This is what human compassion costs." One by one, the tents came down. The Gorvathi miners who shared a shelter in the corner of the yard. They lost their protection. The old Torvan warrior who kept to himself and never spoke to anyone. He lost his protection. The Zeleni families who huddled together for warmth at night. They lost their protection. 43 prisoners stood in the open when the wardens finished their work. And the sun was already setting behind the jungle canopy, and everyone knew what the night would bring. Tiri stood beside her clutch mother, the old Zeleni woman too weak to even stand on her own anymore, and the child looked at Kira with eyes full of fear and confusion. "I am sorry," Kira whispered, but the words felt empty and useless in her mouth. She had tried to save one child, and now she had condemned 43 beings to die. The other prisoners understood this too, and their fear quickly turned to anger, as they realized who was responsible for their suffering. "Human," a Gorvathi miner growled as he stepped toward Kira with his massive fists clenched. "You did this to us." "She should have stayed silent," another prisoner hissed. "We all stay silent. We all survive. That is the rule." "The jungle will take her first," a Torvan said, and his voice was cold with hatred. "We should make sure of it." Kira did not run, and she did not fight back, because she knew they were right to be angry, and she knew she had made a terrible choice that would cost them their lives. But before the Gorvathi could reach her, the first spore cloud rolled in from the canopy. It came like a yellow fog drifting between the trees, and the prisoners who had survived on Corin 4 knew exactly what it meant, and suddenly, their anger at Kira became less important than finding somewhere to breathe. Everyone scattered. Some ran for the processing facility, but the wardens had locked the doors and stood guard with their shock staves ready. Some ran for the rocky outcrops at the edge of the yard, hoping to find cracks and crevices where the spores could not reach them. Some ran for the jungle itself. desperate enough to risk the carnivorous roots and the acid rain rather than stand in the open and choke to death. Kira grabbed Tiri and their clutch mother and pulled them toward a cluster of broadleaf plants at the edge of the yard, and she pressed them down beneath the leaves and told them to breathe shallow and stay still. The spore cloud passed over them like a nightmare made visible, and Kira held her breath until her lungs burned and her vision started to blur at the edges. When the cloud finally drifted past, she gasped for air and felt the sharp sting of particles in her throat. But she was alive, and Tiri was alive, and the clutch mother was still breathing. But the night was not finished with them yet. The rain started an hour later, and it came down hard and fast with drops that sizzled when they hit the ground, and Kira felt the first splash land on her arm and burn through her sleeve like fire. "Move," she told Tiri. "We have to find better cover." They stumbled through the darkness with the rain falling all around them, and Kira could hear the screams of other prisoners who had not found shelter in time, their skin and scales and chitin dissolving under the acid assault. She found a Gorvathy woman crouched beneath a fallen log, her arm already covered in chemical burns, and Kira helped her squeeze further under the log where the rain could not reach. She found a young Torvan male shaking with fear in a hollow between two rocks, and she showed him how to use leaves to channel the rain away from his hiding spot. She moved through the night like a ghost, helping whoever she could find, even though they had wanted to kill her just hours before. By dawn, the rain had stopped and the spore clouds had cleared, and Kira stood in the center of Block 7 and looked at what remained of her fellow prisoners. 11 were dead. Their bodies lay scattered across the yard, some dissolved by the rain, and some choked by the spores, and some dragged half into the jungle by roots that had sensed their weakness. The survivors crawled out from their hiding places and looked at each other with hollow eyes, and no one had the strength to be angry at Kira anymore because they were all too busy being grateful that they had survived the night. But the senior warden was watching from the guard tower, and his compound eyes reflected the morning light as he looked down at the suffering he had caused. 6 more nights, he announced through the speaker system. You will have no shelter for 7 nights total, and then we will see how many of you remember to stay silent. Kira felt something change inside her as she listened to his words. Fear was still there, cold and heavy in her stomach, but something else was growing alongside it now, something hot and fierce that pushed back against the fear. She looked at the jungle that had tried to kill them, and she saw the broad leaves that had sheltered Tiri from the spores, and she saw the fallen log that had protected the Gorvathy woman from the rain, and she saw the hollow rocks that had saved the Torvan male. The jungle was trying to kill them, yes, but the jungle was also full of things that could keep them alive if they knew how to use them. And Kira knew things that none of the other prisoners knew, because she had spent 3 months studying this jungle with the eyes of a xenobiologist, learning which plants were dangerous and which plants were useful and which plants might be turned into tools for survival. She looked up at the senior warden in his tower, and she did not feel afraid of him anymore. She felt angry. "You want us to die out here," she whispered to herself, "but I'm going to show you what humans do when you try to break us." The warden had given them 7 nights without shelter. Kira was going to build something that would last forever. While the other prisoners hid and waited for death, Kira went to work. She started walking the edges of the prison yard as soon as the sun rose high enough to burn away the morning mist, and she ignored the strange looks from the survivors who watched her move with purpose instead of fear. She was looking for a plant she had noticed during her first month on Corin 4, a vine that the other prisoners avoided because it was ugly and aggressive and seemed to serve no purpose, except to strangle the trees it climbed. The Corin Strangler vine, she had called it in her private notes, and she had studied it carefully because something about it had caught her attention. The vine was strong. It wrapped around trees and squeezed so tight that it could crush bark and wood over time. And that meant its fibers had to be incredibly tough to withstand that kind of pressure without breaking. Kira found a patch of the vines near the eastern edge of the yard, and she started cutting them down with a sharp rock she had found near the stream. The work was hard, and her hands started bleeding within the first hour. But she did not stop, because stopping meant dying, and she had decided that she was not going to die on this moon. By midday, she had collected a pile of vines as tall as she was, and she sat down in the shade of a broadleaf tree and started to weave. Her grandmother had taught her to weave baskets when she was a child on Earth, and she had thought that skill was useless in a galaxy full of machines that could manufacture anything you needed. But there were no machines here, and her grandmother's lessons came flooding back as her bloody fingers worked the vines into patterns that grew stronger with each pass. A Gorvathi woman named Vora was the first to approach her. She was the same woman Kira had helped survive the night beneath the fallen log, and her arm was still covered in burns from the acid rain. But she walked over to where Kira was working and stood there watching for a long time. "What are you doing, human?" Vora finally asked. "I am building shelter," Kira said, without looking up from her weaving. "The vines are strong enough to hold together, and if I can make the weave tight enough, it might keep out the spores." "That will not work," Vora said, but there was something in her voice that sounded almost like hope. "Maybe not," Kira agreed, "but I am going to try anyway, because trying is better than waiting to die." Vora stood there for another long moment, and then she sat down across from Kira and picked up some of the vines. "Show me how," she said. And Kira felt something warm bloom in her chest despite the fear and the pain and the exhaustion. By evening, they had woven a mat large enough for 2 people to lie on, and they stretched it between 2 trees at an angle to create a basic lean-to shelter. It was not much, but it was something. And when the spore cloud came that night, Kira and Vora huddled beneath their woven mat and breathed through the gaps in the fibers and survived. The next morning, 3 more prisoners came to them. There was Korvax, a Torvan who had been an engineer before he was sent to Corin for refusing to design weapons for the Dominion. There was Mira, a young Gorvathi woman who had worked in construction and knew how to build things that lasted. And there was Tiri, the Zelini child, who had started all of this, carrying her clutch mother on her back because the old woman could no longer walk on her own. "We want to help," Korvax said, and his voice was rough, like he was not used to asking for anything. Kira looked at the small group standing before her, and she saw fear in their eyes, but she also saw something else, something that looked like the beginning of belief. "Then let me show you what we need," she said, and she started teaching. She taught them about the strangler vines and how to weave them tight. She taught them about the ironbark tree and the sap it produced, a thick black substance that hardened into a waterproof shell when exposed to the acidic rain. She taught them about the broadleaf plants that could filter spores from the air, and she showed them how to layer the leaves over their woven structure to create a natural air filter. Korvax added his own knowledge, showing them how to angle the support beams so the structure could withstand strong winds. Mira showed them how to dig channels in the ground to direct water away from their shelter. Even Tiri helped, her small hands perfect for threading vines through tight spaces that adult fingers could not reach. By the 4th night, they had built something that was more than a lean-to. It was a shelter large enough to hold 12 people, with walls woven from strangler vine and sealed with iron bark sap, with a roof layered in broad leaves and angled to let the acid rain slide off without pooling. Other prisoners came to them now, drawn by the sight of something growing in the middle of the prison yard while everything else was dying. Some came to mock them and tell them their shelter would never work. Some came to beg for a place inside when the next storm came, and some came to learn. Sitting beside Kira as she wove and watching her hands and asking questions about how she knew to do these things. Humans do not survive because we are the strongest, Kira told them as she worked. We are not the fastest or the toughest or the most dangerous species in the galaxy. But we are still here after millions of years because we learned one simple truth. What truth? Tiri asked, her blue skin glowing softly in the fading light. We survive because we adapt, Kira said. And she looked at the group of aliens who had gathered around her. Gorvathy and Torvan and Zelini all working together on something that none of them could have built alone. And we do it together. On the fifth night, the storm came harder than any night before, with rain so thick it looked like walls of water falling from the sky and wind strong enough to tear branches from trees. The shelter creaked and groaned under the assault. And for one terrible moment, Kira thought it would collapse and kill everyone inside, but it held. The woven walls bent but did not break, and the ironbark sap kept the water out, and the broad leaves filtered the air so they could breathe. 23 prisoners survived that night inside the shelter, pressed together so tight they could barely move, but alive and breathing and safe from the jungle that wanted to consume them. When morning came and the storm finally passed, Kira stepped outside and looked at what they had built, and she felt tears running down her face. They had done it. They had survived without the Wardens and their tents, and they had done it by working together and using the jungle itself to protect them from its own dangers. But Kira knew this was only the beginning, because 7 nights would end soon and the Wardens would come back. And she wanted to make sure they found something that would make them understand what humans could do when you tried to break them. We need to build bigger, she said to the group gathered around her, and she saw hope shining in their eyes now instead of fear. We need to build something that will last forever. And they believed her. 2 weeks had passed since the Wardens took their tents, and Block 7 had become something that no one on Corin 4 had ever seen before. Where there had once been 43 scattered and dying prisoners, there was now a structure that rose from the prison yard like a living thing, woven from jungle vines and sealed with tree sap and covered in layers of broad leaves that made it look like it had grown from the ground itself. The prisoners called it the Refuge, and every day it grew larger and stronger as more hands joined the work. Kira stood at the center of the construction site and directed teams of workers who had once been strangers and enemies, but who now moved together like parts of a single machine. The Gorvathy used their incredible strength to haul heavy loads of vines and branches from the jungle edge. The Torvan used their natural resistance to toxins to harvest ironbark sap from deep in the forest where the spore clouds were thickest. The Zelini used their bioluminescence to light the interior of the Refuge, their soft blue glow turning the woven walls into something beautiful instead of just functional. Korvax, the engineer, had redesigned the support structure 3 times, each version stronger than the last, until the frame could withstand winds that would have torn apart a standard Dominion shelter pod. Mira, the builder, had created a drainage system that channeled acid rain away from the foundation and into collection pools where it could be neutralized and used for cleaning. And little Tiri had become something like a mascot for the whole project, running messages between work teams and bringing water to tired workers and reminding everyone why they were doing this in the first place. Even Tiri's clutch mother was recovering now that she had proper shelter and care. The other prisoners had pooled their medical knowledge and their ration supplements to treat her lung infection, and she was breathing easier every day. She could not work yet, but she sat at the entrance of the Refuge and greeted everyone who came and went. And her presence reminded them that this was not just about survival anymore. This was about taking care of each other. The Wardens watched all of this from their guard towers with growing unease. The 7-night punishment had ended days ago, but they had not offered to return the tents because they were waiting for the Refuge to fail. They were waiting for the prisoners to turn on each other and tear apart what they had built. They were waiting for the jungle to break through their defenses and finish what the punishment had started. But none of that happened, and instead the refuge kept growing. And the prisoners kept working together. And something that the Wardens had never heard from Block 7 before started echoing across the prison yard: laughter. Real laughter from beings who had forgotten what it felt like to be happy, who had spent months or years living in fear and isolation, who had never imagined that they could build something beautiful in the middle of a prison designed to break them. The senior warden could not ignore it any longer. He descended from his tower on the 15th day and walked across the prison yard toward the refuge, his 6 legs carrying him with a grace that seemed wrong for a creature so large and terrifying. The prisoners stopped working when they saw him coming, and fear flickered in their eyes because they had learned that wardens only came to Block 7 to deliver punishment. But Kira stepped forward to meet him, and she did not look afraid. "Senior Warden," she said, and her voice was calm and steady, "have you come to inspect our work?" The warden's compound eyes moved slowly across the refuge, taking in every woven wall and every sealed joint and every drainage channel. And his mandibles clicked together in a sound that Kira could not interpret. "You built this," he said, and it was not a question but something closer to an accusation. "We all built it," Kira replied. "Gorvathy and Torvan and Zelini in one human, working together because you showed us that we could not survive alone." "I showed you that resistance brings suffering," the warden said, and his voice was cold and sharp like metal scraping against stone. "You showed us that we needed each other," Kira said, and she did not back down even though the warden towered over her and could kill her with a single swipe of his clawed limbs. "You took what we needed to survive, so we made something better. And now you have to decide what to do about it." The warden was silent for a long moment, and Kira could feel the other prisoners holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen. Would he order the refuge destroyed? Would he have Kira executed for defiance? Would he punish them all over again and prove that resistance truly was futile? "The Dominion sends inspectors to this moon every cycle," the warden finally said, and his voice was different now, quieter and more thoughtful. "They count the dead and measure our productivity and decide whether Corin 4 is worth the resources it consumes." Kira did not understand why he was telling her this, but she stayed silent and listened. "Last cycle we lost 400 prisoners," the warden continued. "The cycle before that we lost 350, and the inspectors were not pleased because dead prisoners cannot work and cannot pay back their debt to the Dominion. So you need us alive," Kira said, and suddenly she understood what was happening. "I need you productive," the warden corrected. "I need to show the inspectors that Corin 4 produces results, and dead prisoners do not produce anything except paperwork." He turned his compound eyes toward the refuge again, and Kira thought she saw something like calculation in those dark surfaces. "Your shelter is interesting," he said. "It should not work, and yet it does. And that makes me wonder what else you could build if you had the resources." Kira felt hope rising in her chest, but she kept her face neutral because she knew this was not generosity. This was negotiation. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want results," the warden said. "I want to show the inspectors that Block 7 is the most productive block on this moon. And in exchange I will allow your shelter to stand, and I will not punish those who helped build it." It was not freedom, and it was not kindness, but it was something, and Kira knew that sometimes you had to take small victories and build them into larger ones. "And if we exceed your expectations?" she asked, pushing just a little further. The warden's mandibles spread in what she now recognized as his version of a smile. "Then perhaps we can discuss providing materials that do not come from the jungle," he said. "Perhaps we can discuss expanding your shelter to other blocks. Perhaps we can discuss many things that would benefit both of us." He turned and walked away without waiting for her response, and Kira watched him go with a strange mix of emotions swirling in her chest. She had just made a deal with the creature who had tried to kill them all. But she had also just secured their right to keep building, and that was worth something. Vora stepped up beside her and put a heavy Golvethi hand on her shoulder. "Do you trust him?" Vora asked. "No," Kira said honestly, "but I do not need to trust him. I just need to be more useful to him alive than dead, and as long as we keep building and keep producing, he will have a reason to protect us." She turned to face the crowd of prisoners who had gathered around her, and she saw hope and determination in their eyes. "The Wardens think they are using us," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But we are going to use this opportunity to build something they cannot take away. Something that will change this prison forever. And by the time they realize what we have done, it will be too late to stop us." The prisoners cheered, and the sound echoed across the yard, and the other blocks heard it and wondered what was happening in Block 7 that could make anyone on Corin 4 sound happy. The Refuge had survived its first test, but Kira knew that bigger tests were coming, and she had to be ready for them. The storm that came in the third month was the worst anyone on Corin 4 had ever seen, and even the Wardens in their fortified towers looked up at the sky with something like fear in their compound eyes. The clouds rolled in from the northern mountains, like a wall of darkness swallowing the sun, and the wind began to howl through the jungle canopy with a sound like 1,000 screaming voices. The senior warden activated the emergency protocols and ordered all prisoners to seek shelter immediately. But for most of them, there was nowhere to go because the standard issue tents were already shaking and tearing under the force of the wind. Kira stood at the entrance of the Refuge and watched the storm approach. And she felt fear, but she also felt something else. Something that might have been pride. The Refuge had grown over the past weeks, expanding from a shelter for 12 to a complex that could hold nearly 100 beings, with multiple rooms and corridors and even a medical bay where Tiri's clutch mother helped treat the sick and injured. They had reinforced the walls with a double layer of woven vines. They had added support beams made from ironbark wood that was harder than steel. They had dug the foundations deeper into the ground so the wind could not lift them away. But this storm was unlike anything they had prepared for, and Kira did not know if even the Refuge could survive what was coming. "Everyone inside," she called out, and her voice carried across the yard despite the growing roar of the wind. "Block 7 and anyone else who needs shelter, get inside now." Prisoners from other blocks started running toward the Refuge as their own tents collapsed behind them, and Kira's people guided them inside without hesitation. A Torvan from Block 3, who had once spit at Kira in the food line. A Gorvathi from Block 5, who had called her a troublemaker and blamed her for everything bad that happened on the moon. A group of Zelini from Block 8, who had refused to share their water rations when Block 7 was struggling. All of them came running to the Refuge, and all of them were welcomed inside because Kira had taught her people that survival meant lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. The storm hit like the fist of an angry god. Rain fell so hard and so fast that it looked like solid sheets of water instead of individual drops. And the acid in it was strong enough to dissolve the synthetic material of the Dominion tents within minutes. Wind tore through the prison yard and ripped everything loose from the ground. Tents and equipment and storage containers all spinning through the air like toys thrown by a giant child. Lightning struck the guard towers and sent sparks showering down into the chaos below. And Kira heard the Wardens screaming as their equipment failed and their fortifications crumbled. Inside the Refuge, nearly 200 prisoners huddled together in the darkness, and the walls creaked and groaned under the assault from outside. "It is going to collapse," someone wailed, and panic started to spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. "No," Kira said, and her voice cut through the fear like a blade. "We built this together, and it is going to hold." She moved through the crowd, touching shoulders and speaking calm words. and the others who had built the refuge did the same, spreading reassurance and confidence, even though they were just as scared as everyone else. Kovacs checked the support beams and reported that they were bending but not breaking. Myra checked the drainage channels and reported that they were overwhelmed but still functioning. Vora organized the strongest prisoners to brace the walls from inside, their bodies adding extra support where the wind was pushing hardest. The storm raged for 6 hours. 6 hours of wind and rain and thunder and lightning while the refuge shook and swayed but never fell. While the prisoners inside held each other and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm ended, the clouds broke apart, and the sun came through. And Kira opened the entrance of the refuge and stepped outside into a world that had been transformed. The prison yard was destroyed. The processing facility had lost its roof. The storage buildings had been flattened. The guard towers were damaged and dark. And every single standard issue tent in every single block had been torn apart and scattered across the jungle. Except for Block 7, except for the refuge. It stood alone in the middle of the devastation, battered and bent but unbroken. A testament to what prisoners could build when they stopped being victims and started being creators. The senior warden emerged from his damaged tower and looked across the yard with compound eyes that could not hide his shock. And he walked slowly toward the refuge as if he could not believe what he was seeing. How? He asked, and his voice was quiet, almost humble. Because we built it together, Kira said. And she was tired and sore and covered in mud, but she had never felt stronger in her life. Because we learned to use the jungle instead of fighting against it. Because we made something that belonged here instead of something that was imposed from outside. The warden looked at the prisoners streaming out of the refuge. Gorvathy and Torvan and Gislini all working together to assess the damage and start repairs. And something changed in his expression. The inspectors will be here in 3 days, he said. They will want to know how this happened, and I will have to give them answers. Tell them the truth, Kira said. Tell them that a human showed your prisoners how to survive without your help, and now they do not need you anymore. It was a bold thing to say, perhaps a dangerous thing to say. But Kira did not care anymore because she had already proven that she was not afraid of this warden or his punishments. The warden's mandibles clicked slowly, and then he did something that Kira had never seen a warden do before. He lowered his head. The inspectors will want to meet you, he said. They will want to understand what you have done here. And I believe they will want you to do it again in other prisons. Kira felt the weight of what he was saying settle over her shoulders. The possibility that the refuge could become more than just a shelter for Block 7. That it could become a model for every prison in the Dominion. And what happens to us if we help them? She asked. I do not know, the warden admitted. But I know that everything on this moon has changed because of what you built. And changes like this do not go unnoticed by the powers that rule the galaxy. The inspectors arrived 3 days later, and they walked through the refuge with wide eyes and disbelieving expressions. And they asked Kira 1,000 questions about how she had done this impossible thing. She told them about the strangler vines and the ironbark sap and the broadleaf filters. But mostly she told them about cooperation and trust and the power of treating prisoners like people instead of problems. They listened and they took notes. And when they left, they took something else with them too. Hope. Months later, reports came in from other Dominion prisons where inmates had started building their own versions of the refuge. Woven shelters that use local materials and community labor to create something the authorities had never provided. The Dominion did not know how to respond, because crushing these movements would destroy productivity, but allowing them to continue meant admitting that prisoners could take care of themselves better than wardens could. And at the center of it all, on a jungle moon that had once been designed to break the spirits of everyone sent there, Kira Vasquez stood at the entrance of the refuge and welcomed another group of new arrivals. The Wardens will tell you that this place will destroy you, she said to them. They will tell you that survival means obedience and silence and fear. But I am here to tell you something different. She gestured at the structure behind her, at the woven walls and the glowing Zelini lights and the diverse crowd of prisoners who had become a family. This is what happens when you refuse to break, she said. This is what happens when you work together instead of against each other. And this is what humans do when you try to take everything from us. She smiled at them, and they looked back at her with eyes that were beginning to understand. Welcome to the Refuge, she said. There is always room for more. And behind her, woven from jungle vines and sealed with tree sap and built by hands that had learned to create instead of destroy, the Refuge stood as proof that even in the darkest places in the galaxy, hope could grow if you were brave enough to plant the seeds. The Wardens had removed every tent, and the human had built a world.